The first thing that hit me wasn't the smell of old paper, or the faint, sour tang of a life lived alone. It was the ozone. That sharp, electric smell, like the air after a lightning strike, or the static clinging to an old tube television. It was the smell of energy. My estranged aunt, Dr. Aris Thorne, hadn't died. She had, according to the official police report, ceased to be present. One day, she was the eccentric recluse in apartment 7B, a theoretical mathematician obsessed with non-Euclidean geometry. The next, she was gone. Her door was deadbolt from the inside. Her wallet, keys, and phone were on the kitchen counter. She just wasn't there anymore. And since I was her only living relative, this apartment, this dense, suffocating museum of calculations, was now mine. The place was a labyrinth of her mind. Every wall was a chalkboard, covered in equations I couldn't begin to decipher. Stacks of journals and textbooks formed precarious towers that threatened to collapse if I breathed too hard. It wasn't a home, it was a workshop for a single, frantic purpose. I'd spent the last 2 weeks just trying to organize it, to separate the important documents from the ramblings of a genius, or maybe, a lunatic. I was getting headaches. Vicious, splitting migraines that started behind my right eye and made the electric smell of the apartment even stronger. The anomaly was in the far corner of the living room, next to her main chalkboard. At first, I thought it was just bad plasterwork. The building was pre-war, and corners are rarely perfect. But this was different. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, didn't just meet in the corner. It seemed to pucker, like the wall itself was being pinched by an invisible hand. The 90-degree angle wasn't 90 degrees. It looked deeper. I'd tried to measure it. I put a framing square against it, and the metal arms rested flat, but my eyes told me something different. It was an optical illusion, I told myself. A trick of the light and the disorienting, chalk-dusted air. Then I found the audio logs. She hadn't just written in her journals. She'd used an old micro-cassette recorder. I was in the kitchen, bagging up expired food, when I clicked play on the first tape. Her voice, dry and academic, filled the room. Static crackle. Log 14.4. The constants are variable. I was wrong to assume they were fixed. The universe is sloppier than I believed. A pause, a sharp inhale. I've confirmed the resonance. It's not a place. It's an error. A fold in the fabric. I think I've stabilized it. Right here, in the living room. The calculations hold. I stopped bagging. I looked from the kitchen, through the doorway, at that puckered corner. The floral wallpaper seemed to ripple, just for a second. I kept listening. Log 14.7. The resonance is clean. Almost musical. But it's attracting observation. I feel it. When I turn my back to the corner, I feel pressure. Like the air is thickening behind me. The numbers prove it. Something is aware of the knot. Knot? I whispered. Log 14.9. It's cold. The localized temperature drop is now 15 degrees Celsius below ambient. It's drawing energy from the room. It's hungry. I tried to close it. I tried to unwind the calculations. But the knot it's not a string. It's a burrow. And I'm not the one who dug it. I just pointed to where the dirt was soft. I was getting a headache. That sharp, electric pain. I fumbled for the Tylenol in my pocket and walked into the living room, standing before the main chalkboard. It was covered in a single, massive equation that spiraled inward. I looked at the corner. The knot. It was colder. Noticeably. I could see my breath fog. I reached a hand out, not to touch it, just to feel the air. 5 feet away, the air was warm, stale. 3 feet away, it was chilly. 1 foot away, it was arctic. My fingers went numb. I pulled my hand back, rubbing it. This was insane. Some kind of localized thermal, something. Log 15.1, her voice suddenly crackled from the recorder on the kitchen counter. It was louder. More afraid. It's not a they. It's an it. And it's learning. The angles are wrong now. It's looking through. I see, oh God. I see. The tape cut to static. I stood frozen in the center of the room. The only sound was the HSSSSS of the recorder and my own pulse hammering in my ears. I had to get out. I needed air. I grabbed my mug, half full of cold coffee, from a stack of books. My hands were shaking from the cold. As I turned to leave, the mug slipped. It fell. But it didn't shatter. It hit the hardwood floor, maybe 4 feet from the corner. And instead of bouncing or spilling, it skidded. It slid across the floor, faster and faster, not like it was rolling, but like it was being pulled. It shot towards the knot. I watched, unable to move, as the ceramic mug hit the baseboard. And it didn't stop. The front edge of the mug bent. The ceramic, the solid, glazed porcelain, began to fold. It stretched like taffy, indenting into the right angle of the wall. The handle snapped off and clattered to the floor, but the body of the mug, it just squeezed. It compressed, distorted, and then slid into the wall. It vanished into the impossible geometry of that corner. I stared at the spot where it had been. There was no hole. No crack. Just the puckered, floral wallpaper. I was backing away, my heart trying to escape my chest, when I heard it. It wasn't on the tape. It wasn't in the hallway. It was a sound, low and wet, like a dozen sticky fingers drumming against drywall. And it was coming from inside the knot. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The sound had frozen in my throat, choked off by that electric, ozone sting. My first instinct was to run. Grab my keys, slam the door, and never look back. Let the bank foreclose. Let the city condemn the building. I didn't care. But I was paralyzed, my back pressed against the bookshelf on the opposite wall. The sound continued. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was slow, rhythmic, and heavy. It wasn't fingers drumming. It was heavier, like someone slapping a side of beef against plaster. And it was damp. A faint, underlying slickness to the noise. It was inside the wall. Inside the knot. I bolted for the door. My hand was on the deadbolt when the lights in the apartment flickered. They didn't just dim, they bent. The light from the ceiling fixture seemed to curve for a millisecond, pulled towards the corner, before snapping back. The headache I'd been nursing exploded behind my right eye, a spike of pure, crystalline pain. I cried out, clutching my head. The ozone smell was overwhelming, thick as smoke. Thwack. Thwack. It was closer. Not physically closer in the room, but the sound was clearer. Sharper. Like it had just learned how to make the sound travel properly through our dimension. I stumbled back, leaning against the wall, breathing hard. Okay, Aris, I whispered, the words trembling. What did you do? Running wasn't an option. Not yet. I couldn't just leave this thing in a residential building. The mug proved it was interactive. The sound proved it was aware. I needed to know what she knew. The audio logs were too fragmented. I needed the source code. Her journals. I forced myself to move, skirting the living room, giving the knot as wide a berth as the apartment allowed. The thwacking sound paused as I moved, as if it was listening to my footsteps. I froze. The room was utterly silent. I took another step. Thwack. A single, violent impact, so hard the floor vibrated beneath my feet. It was angry. It knew I was here. I scrambled to her desk, a massive mahogany slab piled high with notebooks. They were all just equations, spiral-bound pages filled with frantic, precise calculations. They were useless to me. I was looking for For what? A diary? A confession? I found it under a stack of texts on topology. It wasn't a spiral notebook. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind accountants used 100 years ago. It felt different. Heavier. I opened it. The first page wasn't calculations. It was writing. Her handwriting, tight and controlled. Entry 401, it is not a door. It is a suture. Space-time is not a smooth sheet, it is a poorly healed wound, and I have found the scar tissue. The knot, as I call it, is a point where the stitches are pulling loose. I flipped the page. Entry 402, the error is beautiful. The geometry is recursive. The angles are impossible, but they work. I have proven it. I have sent probes. Small, inorganic. Ball bearings. A wristwatch. They do not return. But the data returns. The temporal distortion is significant. A 2-second pass-through resulted in 48.7 years of localized temporal degradation on the watch. It returned, dusted. I kept turning, my hands shaking. The thwacking had resumed, but it was softer now. More curious. Probing. Asterisk entry 404, I made a mistake. I sent something organic. A common housefly. I trapped it in a vial and passed it through. I did not get data. I got a signal. An echo. It wasn't a hello. It was a yes. I have confirmed the observation hypothesis. The resonance is a two-way street. I am not just looking at the error. The error is looking back. The headache was making the page swim. The ozone was so thick I could taste it, like sucking on a 9-volt battery. Entry 407, it has a shape. I think. It's not a shape our senses can process. It exists in more dimensions than we do. When it looks at me, I don't see it. I feel it as a pressure in the adjacent possible. It's like a blind man trying to describe the color red by touching a fire. The information is incomplete and it burns. Then, on the next page, there was a drawing. It wasn't a good drawing. It was frantic, sketched in ballpoint pen, the lines dug deep into the paper. It was a mess of intersecting, impossible angles, like an M.C. Escher sketch drawn during an earthquake. It was sprawling. It was a sketch of the knot. But in the center of the geometric chaos, there was something else. A suggestion. A shape implied by the negative space. It looked. I tilted my head, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a cluster of joints. Dozens of them. Like the knuckles of a hand a mile wide, all folded in on themselves, waiting to open. I stared at the drawing, my blood turning to ice. The thwacking stopped. The room was deathly quiet. I looked up from the journal, my eyes scanning the room. The lights were stable. The air was still. Then I saw the shadow. The lamp on my aunt's desk was casting my shadow against the far wall. But there was another shadow, one that didn't belong. It was being cast from the knot. This was impossible. The knot was in the darkest corner of the room. There was no light source behind it to cast a shadow outward. The shadow was long and thin, stretching across the floorboards like a spear of black ice. It was impossibly dark, a void of black that seemed to drink the light of the room. And as I watched, frozen in horror, the shadow moved. It wasn't a flicker. It didn't waver. It slid, detaching itself from the corner. It crept across the floor, moving against the light, inching its way toward the desk. It was the shadow of something long, thin, and jointed. Like a single, extended finger. And it was pointing directly at me. My breath caught, a dry, sharp gasp that was swallowed by the buzzing in my ears. The shadow wasn't just pointing. It was reaching. It slithered from the floor, fluid as spilled ink, and climbed the leg of Aris's desk. I scrambled backward, my palms slipping on the dusty hardwood, until my back slammed into the solid, grounding reality of the apartment door. The shadow wasn't flat. That was the detail that broke my sanity. It wasn't a two-dimensional projection. It had edges. It had depth. It wasn't a lack of light, it was an insertion of darkness. It crawled onto the desktop. It brushed against a stack of loose-leaf calculations. The papers didn't move, but they curled. The edges instantly turned a septic yellow-brown and flaked away, as if blasted by a century of sunlight in a single second. Temporal degradation. The 48.7 years. It was touching the room with time itself. Get back, I hissed, the word useless, ridiculous. The shadow tendril paused. It lifted from the desk, peeling itself from the wood, and hung suspended in the air, a three-dimensional ribbon of non-reflective black, twisting lazily in a breeze that didn't exist. The heavy, wet thwacking sound from the knot was gone. It had been replaced by a faint, high-pitched whine, like a capacitor charging to impossible levels. It was the sound of the air itself straining around the tendril. My headache wasn't pain anymore, it was a blinding, white-hot pressure. The tendril snaked through the air, moving with a deliberate, alien grace. It wasn't random. It was scanning. It stopped, hovering over the small, silver micro-cassette recorder I had left on the desk. "No," I whispered. "Don't." The tendril touched it. It didn't push it or knock it over. It enveloped it. The pure darkness wrapped around the small plastic device like a glove closing. For a beat, nothing happened. The whine peaked, so high it was barely audible, vibrating in my teeth. Then, the recorder clicked. The play button depressed, pushed by an invisible, impossible finger. The HSSSS of static filled the room, but it was wrong. It was deeper, harsher, with a rattling undertone. And then, a voice came through the speaker. It was not Aris. It was not human. It was a sound like grinding continents, like stone plates scraping together, filtered through a cheap, tinny speaker. It was a dry, rattling monotone, and it wasn't speaking words. It was speaking mathematics. 9.44 Epsilon. Sequence. Fold. The voice was guttural, a vibration that rattled my sternum. Pi. Sub 7. Vector. Breach. Query. My eyes darted to the journal I'd dropped. It was on the floor near my feet, splayed open. Open to the page with Aris's frantic sketch of the knuckles. The shadow tendril retracted. Faster than sight, it snapped back from the recorder, a whip crack of pure void, and disappeared into the puckered wallpaper of the knot. It was gone. The room was plunged into a deafening, throbbing silence. The high-pitched whine vanished. The ozone smell receded, leaving only the metallic taste of old blood on my tongue. The pressure in my skull eased, dulling to a familiar, pounding ache. I was panting, my shirt cold and slick with sweat. I was alone. It was over. The recorder clicked again. The impossible, grinding voice was gone. It was just the gentle HSSSSS of an empty tape. I sagged against the door, my knees weak with relief. And that's when I heard the other sound. It wasn't from the recorder. It wasn't from the knot. It was faint, but sickeningly clear. It was scratching. It was the sound of something hard and sharp, like a shard of porcelain or a filed piece of bone, being dragged slowly, deliberately, down the far side of the apartment door. The door I was leaning against. It was in the hallway. The sound was dry. A mineral scrape. Scree, drag, click. It wasn't a claw. It wasn't flesh. It was the sound of something hard and unnatural being dragged across the metal-plated exterior of the apartment door. It was the sound of that mug. I recoiled, pushing myself away from the door, my back hitting the opposite wall of the narrow foyer. My hand, which had been on the deadbolt, was stinging. I looked down. My palm was red, not from a burn, but from an aggressive, unnatural cold. The deadbolt itself was coated in a thin, shimmering layer of frost. The cold from the knot, it wasn't just in the corner anymore. It was at the exit. My lungs were useless. I couldn't pull in a breath. The apartment, which had felt too big, too full of my aunt's terrifying research, suddenly felt like a shoebox. A coffin. The knot was behind me, in the living room. This thing was in front of me, in the hall. The scratching stopped. Silence. The same throbbing, pressurized silence from before. It knows I'm here. I had to see. I had to know what was on the other side. My legs felt like cement as I forced myself to stand. I crept back to the door, my eye drawn to the peephole. The brass ring was dark, the frost creeping outward from the deadbolt, encrusting the wood grain in delicate, icy patterns. I wiped the fog of my own breath from the lens and pressed my eye against the cold glass. The hallway. It was wrong. The fisheye lens always distorted things, but this was a mockery of physics. The beige, damask wallpaper of the hallway was stretched. Mrs. Petrov's door, apartment 7A, which should have been just across the hall, looked like it was 100 yards away, the door number a tiny, unreadable speck. The overhead light fixture wasn't a bulb, it was a long, thin streak of yellow, pulled taut like a strand of spaghetti. But the carpet, the faded red carpet of the hallway floor, was closer. It seemed to be curving up, rushing towards my perspective, the pattern warping and swelling. The geometry was bleeding out. Scree-click. The sound was below the peephole. I dropped my gaze. The mail slot. A thin, horizontal brass flap set in the middle of the door. The sound was coming from there. I fell to my knees, my heart a trapped bird. I was afraid to look, terrified of what I'd see looking back. But I had to. Slowly, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace them on the door, I lowered my head. I put my eye to the narrow, dark slit of the mail slot. I was not looking into the hallway. I was looking at my aunt's floral wallpaper. I was looking back into the living room. The exit was gone. The door, this solid, 3-inch thick piece of fire-rated oak, was no longer a barrier between the apartment and the hallway. It was a fold. A loop. The creature hadn't left the apartment, it had just rerouted the architecture. My mind was screaming, but I couldn't move. I was mesmerized, staring through the slot at the impossible, familiar corner. And something was there, on the other side, in the living room, hovering right in front of the slot. It was a shard of white porcelain. It was sharp, jagged, the curved lip of the coffee mug I had watched vanish. It was just floating in the air, vibrating with a high-frequency hum. The air around it shimmered with cold. It had been this shard, manipulated from inside the knot, that had been scratching the outside of the door. A cat playing with a mouse from 2 dimensions over. As I watched, paralyzed, the shard twisted. It rotated slowly, deliberately, until its sharpest, needle-like point was aimed directly at the mail slot. Aimed directly at my eye. From the living room behind me, the tape recorder clicked on. The grinding, continental voice filled the apartment, no longer a query, but a statement. Construct. Is. Here. I threw myself backward, tumbling onto the foyer floor, a split second before the white shard shot through the mail slot. It moved with the speed of a bullet. It punched through the brass flap, sending it spinning, and embedded itself, thrumming, deep into the wall of the foyer, exactly where my head had been. The shard, slick with a black, oily substance that was not coffee, vibrated with such intensity that a hairline crack began to spread up the plaster wall. And from that crack, a wisp of absolute, light-devouring darkness began to leak, coiling into the air like a strand of smoke. I was on my hands and knees in the foyer, hyperventilating. The air was frigid, the frost from the deadbolt now creeping in a perfect, crystalline circle around the entire doorframe. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my limbs felt heavy, numb. The shard in the wall was singing. A high-pitched, resonant thrum that I felt in my jawbone. The wisp of darkness was not smoke. It was coiling, thickening, pouring from the crack in the plaster like a steady stream of black, viscous oil. It pooled on the hardwood floor, a perfectly circular puddle of anti-light that was already a foot wide. I watched, frozen, as the darkness flexed. It wasn't a liquid. It was a substance. It pushed itself up, defying gravity, forming a small, quivering mound. The plaster around the shard was wrong. It wasn't just cracked, it was dissolving. It was sloughing off the wall in gray, wet handfuls, like damp cement, revealing the dark, rotting lath underneath. The structure was being unmade. This thing, this construct, was leaking entropy. I had to move. I couldn't be trapped between the knot in the living room and this ulcer at the door. I crab-walked backward, my palms slipping in the dust, my eyes locked on the growing black shape. I had to get back to the desk. Back to the journals. Aris must have found a way to fight it, not just cease to be present. The recorder in the living room clicked. That wet, grinding, continental voice echoed, calmer this time. The Aperture holds. Good, construct. It was praising it. The mound of shadow in the foyer quivered in response. It was pleased. I scrambled to my feet, kicked the heavy journal I'd dropped, and lunged for the desk. I needed more. I needed the end of the story. I tore through the leather ledger, the pages flying. Aris's handwriting was deteriorating, the neat academic script devolving into a wild, jagged slash of ink. Entry 410, it's not geometry. It's grammar. The universe is a language, and the fundamental constants are its rules of syntax. The knot is a typo. A logical fallacy. And the thing on the other side, it's a reader. It's learning our language by breaking our grammar. My eyes scanned the page, desperate. The logic was insane, but it felt true. The bent light. The warped hallway. The folded door. It was editing reality. Entry 411, I tried to speak back. I used the constants. I broadcasted Planck's constant, the speed of light, the gravitational constant. I thought they were our rules. Our defense. But they're not. They're just suggestions. And it laughed. I stopped. Laughed? How? The recorder clicked. The grinding voice was gone. A new sound filled the apartment. It was a rapid, wet clicking and chittering. It was the sound of 1,000 arrhythmic, chitinous castanets, a sound of glee so profound, so utterly alien, that my stomach revolted. I clamped a hand over my mouth, ball rising in my throat. It was laughing at me. The thrum of the shard in the foyer changed. It deepened, becoming a heavy, resonant thud, thud, thud. I looked up from the journal, my blood running cold. The puddle of darkness was gone. It was standing. It was low to the ground, maybe 2 feet tall, a tripod of solid, light-eating shadow. 3 jointed, root-like legs, a thick, pulsating body, and the porcelain shard. It was no longer embedded in the wall. The construct had pulled it free. The shard was now held in its center, a single, glowing, malevolent white eye that scanned the room. Thud. Thud. It took a step. It wasn't a slide. It was a step. It lifted one of its 3 legs, a limb of pure void, and placed it down. When it did, the hardwood floor beneath it didn't just creak. It died. The wood turned a dull, lifeless gray. The varnish flaked away. The grain of the wood unraveled, the fibers separating into a damp, pulpy mush. It left a 3-pronged footprint of absolute decay. It was in the apartment. It was walking. And it was moving, slowly, deliberately, towards the knot. Towards its source. It was going to join the main body. Thud, shluish. The sound was the most hideous thing I had ever heard. The thud was the heavy, 3-pointed landing of its void limbs. The shluish was the sound of the floorboards giving up. It was the sound of matter capitulating, the fibers of the wood unmaking themselves into a damp, gray pulp. The wet, chittering laughter from the knot was its percussion. It emerged from the narrow foyer, a 3-legged horror of pure, solid shadow. The porcelain shard, its eye, glowed with a sick, cold, internal light, swiveling in its socket of darkness. It scanned the room, not with the jerky movements of an animal, but with the smooth, calculated motions of a lens. The smell hit me next. The sharp ozone was still there, but it was now undershot with something else. The scent of rot. Not the rot of meat, but the dry, papery rot of ancient books left in a damp cellar. It was the smell of time itself going stale. It was walking towards the knot. It had to pass the desk to get there. I was pressed against the back of the mahogany desk, my knuckles white, the leather journal clutched in my hand. I was a rabbit in the path of a combine harvester. Thud, shloosh. It was parallel to me now. 10 feet away. The cold was a physical weight. It was a crushing, heavy pressure of stillness, leaching the heat from my skin, from the air, from the very light in the room. I could see my breath, a cloud of panicked fog that seemed to bend towards the construct, drawn in by its temporal gravity. The chittering laughter from the corner stopped. The construct paused. It had been ignoring me, focused on its destination. But now, it knew I was here. The shard eye clicked, an audible, sharp snap, and swiveled. It faced me. The room was so quiet I could hear the hiss of the pulpwood fibers it was standing in. My mind was screaming run, but the door was a lie. The windows. I glanced at them. They were caked in the same thick frost as the door, the glass opaque and spiderwebbed with ice. There was no exit. The journal. It was the only thing. Aris had to have found something. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the page. I fumbled, ripping the brittle paper, my eyes scanning the text while my peripheral vision was locked on the silent, dark thing that was watching me. I flipped past the entry, it laughed. The next page was messy. The handwriting was frantic, the ink bled into the paper as if the page was damp. Entry 412, it doesn't just read. It writes. It's correcting me. It's editing my thoughts. I found a new calculation on my main chalkboard this morning. It wasn't mine. It was elegant. It solved the resonance cascade. It showed me how to stabilize the breach further. How to make the aperture wider. I almost. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a monster. It was an intellectual parasite. It hadn't just killed Aris. It had seduced her. Thud, shloosh. It took a step towards the desk. I recoiled, knocking over a stack of books. The sound was obscenely loud in the silence. The construct paused, its shard eye narrowing, as if focusing. It was 5 feet away. The rug beneath my feet began to gray, the rich red pattern fading to a monochrome slurry. The cold was unbearable, a burning agony in my bones. I was trapped. I was going to die. I flipped to the last page. It was almost empty. Just a few words scrawled in the very center, the pen driven so hard it had torn the paper. It wasn't an equation. It wasn't a warning. It was a thud. Shloosh. It was at the edge of the desk. It reared back slightly, its shadow body tensing. It was going to lunge. I read the final entry. Entry 413, I am the error. I stared at the words, meaningless. What? The construct lunged. It didn't jump. It flowed. It poured itself onto the desk in a wave of consuming darkness, scattering books and papers. The porcelain shard was inches from my face, a beacon of freezing, terrifying intent. I screamed, falling backward in the desk chair, which rolled and slammed into the wall. The thing was on the desk. But it wasn't moving toward me. It had stopped. It was looking at something. It was looking at the small, silver micro-cassette recorder. The porcelain eye tilted, regarded the small machine. A low, new thrum began, a sound of curiosity. And then, the recorder clicked. The play button depressed. It wasn't the grinding, continental voice. It was Aris. Her voice was a whisper, dry and broken, the last audio log I hadn't found. Log 16.1. A long, ragged breath. A wet cough. It's in me. I thought the headaches were just the calculations. The proximity. But it's in me. It's not a parasite. It's a symbiote. It gave me the final equation. It helped me. The construct on the desk was perfectly still, listening. I can see the angles now, Aris whispered, her voice full of a terrible, broken awe. They're so beautiful. The knot, it's not a wound. It's a birth. I have to see it through. I'm not Aris Thorne anymore. I am the Aperture. I am. Her voice cut to static. My headache. The splitting, vicious, electric headache I'd had since I first walked in. The one behind my right eye. I slowly lifted a trembling hand to my face. The construct watched me, its shard eye unblinking. It wasn't looking at me. It was waiting for me. The headache, it wasn't a side effect of the room. It was the entity. It had been in Aris, and now it was in me. The chittering laughter started again from the knot, but this time it was different. It wasn't mocking. It was welcoming. The headache wasn't a headache. It was a presence. The moment the realization hit, the pain didn't stop, it clarified. It wasn't a spike of agony attacking my brain, it was a foreign object settling in, a cube of ice in a glass of water. It was cold, sharp-edged, and utterly other. I could feel it. A cold, hyper-intelligent weight sitting behind my right eye. It wasn't thinking in words. It was thinking in angles. In relationships. I looked at the chalkboard, at the spiraling, mad equation that was Aris's masterpiece. It wasn't madness. It was obvious. The symbols clicked into place, the logic of it unfolding in my mind like a complex, beautiful, and terrifying piece of origami. I saw the typo Aris had found, the grammar she'd mentioned. And I saw the correction the entity had given her. It was elegant. Aperture. The word echoed in my skull, but it wasn't my thought. It was a label. A designation. The construct on the desk, the three-legged tripod of Decay, lowered itself. It was a movement of profound submission. Its three shadow limbs bent, and the porcelain shard dimmed, its aggressive, cold light softening to a dull, milky white. It was bowing. It recognized its new master. Or rather, its master's new tool. The chittering from the knot in the corner intensified, a sound of ecstatic welcome. The presence behind my eye pulsed, and a wave of understanding washed over me. It wasn't a voice. It was a data push. I saw the hallway. I understood the folded door. It was an efficiency. Why travel through a space when you can simply connect the origin and destination? The hallway was a waste of coordinates. The door was a redundant barrier. Sloppy, the presence thought at me. Wasteful. It was showing me. The universe, our universe, was a first draft, full of redundancies and crude, inefficient laws. It was offering me the editor's pen. My gaze drifted from the submissive construct on the desk to the foyer. To the first porcelain shard, the one that had shot through the mail slot and embedded itself in the wall. The spreading crack. The leaking darkness. Messy, the presence hissed in my mind. The thought was full of a cold, geometric disgust. An error. I looked at the shard. I focused on it. The headache behind my eye flared, a sudden, joyful spike. I didn't know what I was doing, but I willed it. I pushed the idea of wrongness at it. The shard vibrated. It didn't fall. It didn't crumble. It faded. The solid white porcelain became translucent, then transparent, like a ghost in the plaster. The crack in the wall stitched itself shut. The darkness that had leaked from it, it retracted, pulled back into the wall as if it were a string being rewound. In 1 second, it was there. The next, it wasn't. And not only was it gone, but the memory of it, it felt slippery. My brain hurt trying to hold on to the fact that it had ever been there. I was remembering a smooth, unbroken wall. I had just edited the last 5 minutes. A wave of dizziness hit me, so profound I gripped the desk to stay standing. It was accompanied by an agonizing, draining cold. It wasn't the external cold from the knot. It was an internal cold, a psychic leeching. I felt a torrent of energy, my warmth, my life, being pulled from me, siphoning out from the presence behind my eye and pouring into the knot in the corner. The chittering roared, a sound of gluttonous, ecstatic feeding. I was the aperture. I wasn't the editor. I was the pen. I was the conduit for the power, and it was draining me to fuel the correction. I gasped, my breath fogging in the frigid air. The construct on the desk, it stirred. It lifted its head. The porcelain eye, which had been dim and submissive, flared back to its aggressive, cold brightness. It turned. It wasn't looking at me. It wasn't looking at the knot. It turned its body, thud, 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 on the desk, until its shard eye was pointing directly at the front door. At the folded, impossible exit. The grinding, continental voice returned, blasting from the knot. But this time it was no longer muffled by static or filtered through a cheap speaker. It was resonant. It was using my mind as its amplifier, and the sound hammered the room, vibrating in my chest. It spoke one, simple, terrifying word. Hungry. Aris Thorne. The construct was pointing to the hallway. To apartment 7A. It was mealtime. The hunger was not an emotion. It was a command. It was a cold, sharp, physical pull in my gut, originating from the ice-pick presence behind my eye. It was a necessity, as basic and undeniable as the need to breathe. It wanted out. It wanted more. The construct on the desk, its porcelain eye burning bright, seemed to hear the command at the same instant. It moved with a terrifying, fluid-like speed. It didn't climb down, it poured itself over the edge of the desk, a waterfall of solid darkness, and landed on the decayed, pulpy floorboards with a wet thud. It didn't wait for me. It scuttled, its 3 legs moving in a tripod gait, directly to the front door. I was compelled to follow. My legs moved without my consent, walking stiffly, as if I were a marionette. I was walking on top of the decayed floor, but my feet didn't sink. The entity was holding me, keeping me from the messy entropy I was now a part of. The construct reached the door. It paused, its shadow body quivering with anticipation. It waited for me. I stopped, a foot behind it. The cold from the door was no longer a frost, it was a deep, penetrating zero that made my joints ache. The construct reached up. One of its shadow limbs extended, stretching like black taffy, and brushed the deadbolt. There was no sound. No click. But the physics of the room snapped back into place. The pressure in my ears popped. The view through the mail slot, the impossible loop back into the living room, vanished. I felt a lurch in my stomach, like an elevator dropping too fast. The door was just a door again. A barrier to the hallway. The presence in my head pulsed its command. Hunger. Now. My hand, slick with a cold sweat that felt more like condensation, rose. It moved toward the peephole. I looked through. The hallway was normal. The beige wallpaper. The faded red carpet. Mrs. Petrov's door, 7A, solid and real, directly across the hall. The illusion was gone. But the air in the hallway was not air. It was shimmering. It was vibrating. It looked like the heat haze over a highway, but it was Arctic. And through that shimmering, I could see shapes. Impossible angles. Shards of wrong geometry. They were flickering in and out of existence, like glitches in a video feed. The hallway was saturated with the knot's influence. It was primed. The hunger spiked. It was no longer a dull ache, it was a demand. It was focused, a predator's gaze, locked on apartment 7A. My other hand, my left hand, rose toward the deadbolt. No. The thought was mine. It was small, a spark of defiance in the overwhelming cold. No. She's an old woman. She brings me mail. The instant I formed the thought, the presence struck. It wasn't a headache. It was a punishment. A spike of such profound, crystalline agony that my vision went white. It was a neurological scream. I collapsed against the door, my knees buckling, a raw, strangled cry tearing from my throat. The construct at my feet turned. It moved with a new viciousness. It was no longer an enforcer, it was a threat. It thudded closer, its shard eye inches from my shin. It was watching me, daring me to disobey again. The cold from its gaze burned my jeans. The presence screamed in my skull. Open it. I couldn't fight both. I was trapped between the immediate, physical threat of the construct, and the internal, agonizing will of the entity. Sobbing, the pain making my vision swim, I fumbled for the deadbolt. My fingers were numb, clumsy. The metal was so cold it stuck to my skin. I twisted. The click of the deadbolt retracting was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The presence surged with a cold, triumphant joy that was not my own. My hand, guided by the thing in my head, moved to the doorknob. It turned. The door swung open. And she was standing right there. Mrs. Petrov. Her gray-blue hair in curlers, her pink, fuzzy bathrobe pulled tight. Her hand was raised, frozen in the act of knocking. Her kind, wrinkled face was a mask of concern. "Dearie," she started, her voice trembling slightly. I heard a terrible noise. It sounded like glass breaking. "Are you all?" Her words died. Her eyes, magnified by her thick glasses, widened. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me. Into the living room. At the knot. Her mouth opened, a perfect O of disbelief. She saw it. She recognized the wrongness. Before she could scream, before I could even blink, the construct at my feet moved. It was not a scuttle. It was a launch. A blur of solid, three-legged shadow. It shot past me, through the doorway, and vanished into her apartment. I heard a single, surprised gasp. And then, from inside 7A, I heard the click of her door locking. I was alone in the hallway. The door to my own apartment, 7B, was wide open. The thing in my head was silent. It wasn't hungry anymore. It was savoring. The silence in the hallway lasted for 3 heartbeats. It was a vast, cold, shimmering silence. The geometric glitches in the air were intensifying, the beige wallpaper seeming to pixelate and reform every few seconds. The door to 7A was shut. Locked from the inside. The door to 7B was open. A gaping maw of shadow and ozone, with the puckered, hungry knot pulsing in the darkness within. I was standing in the between. And then, the sound began. It was not a scream. A scream would have been a mercy. A scream is human. This was the sound of glass. Mrs. Petrov collected glass. Little glass animals, crystal vases, ornate mirrors. I knew this. I'd helped her carry groceries once, and her apartment tinkled every time she moved. Now, it was shattering. A high-pitched, crystalline cacophony erupted from 7A. It was the sound of 1,000 wine glasses, 1,000,000 light bulbs, all exploding at once. A cascade of breaking, singing glass that didn't stop. It just kept going, a continuous, unending avalanche of sound. And underneath it, a thud, sloosh. The construct was walking. The presence behind my eye flared, and the sound became more than sound. I could taste it. I tasted the dry, mineral dust of the shattering crystal. I tasted the sudden, sharp oxidation of the brass picture frames. I tasted the decay of the wood in her antique furniture, the unraveling of the fibers, the same entropic mush that the construct had left on Aris's floor. It was delicious. The thought was not mine, but the sensation was. A cold, electric pleasure ran down my spine, a rich, complex flavor of an entire life being unmade, a symphony of decay that my new symbiote was savoring. It was ecstasy. I doubled over in the hallway, clutching my stomach, not in pain, but in a wave of shared, alien joy that was so profound it was sickening. I was an accomplice to this. I was the sommelier of this meal. The shattering stopped. Abruptly. Like a switch being thrown. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy. Then, a new sound. A low, vibrating hum. The sound of the knot, the sound of the charging capacitor, but magnified. It was coming from 7A. And, a scraping. A slow, rhythmic scree. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged. No. Not dragged. Redrawn. The presence in my head shifted. The ecstasy of the feed was over. Now, it was processing. It was integrating. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling. I looked at the door to 7A. The light. The sliver of light under the door was no longer the warm, yellow glow of her table lamp. It was a brilliant, sterile, white light. The same cold, impossible light from the porcelain shard. It was so bright it cast a sharp, defined rectangle on the warped carpet of the hallway. And it was pulsing. A slow, steady throb. Throb, throb, throb. Like a new, cold, mechanical heart, beating in the apartment next door. I understood. The data push was instant, cold, and clear. It wasn't a meal. It was a conversion. It hadn't killed Mrs. Petrov. It had consumed the space. It had broken down the matter, the inefficient, sloppy arrangement of her life, and was now rebuilding it. It was calibrating her apartment, turning her corner into a second knot. It was replicating. The scraping sound was the construct, redrawing the equations on her walls. A wave of cold, clarifying terror, my terror, finally cut through the entity's satisfaction. I wasn't the aperture. I was the infection. I was patient zero. I backed away, stumbling toward the open door of 7B. I had to what? Run? Where? The universe was the cage. The presence in my head, sated and stronger, turned its full attention back to me. It felt larger now. The ice pick had become an anvil. It didn't punish me this time. It didn't need to. It simply directed me. A single, cold, clear command, resonating in my skull with the logic of an axiom. Work. My body turned, stiff and obedient. The hallway, with its shimmering, broken physics, was at my back. The pulsing, converted tomb of 7A was to my left. I faced the darkness of Aris's apartment. I faced the original error. The entity was done with its snack. Now, it wanted the main course. It wasn't satisfied with a single apartment. It wasn't satisfied with a building. It wanted more. And I was the key. My foot crossed the threshold, back into the apartment. My eyes were drawn, irresistibly, to the main chalkboard. To the elegant, seductive, unfinished equation. The entity had fed. Now, it was time to think. And I was the brain it was going to use. My hand was not my own. It lifted, my fingers plucking a piece of chalk from the tray. The chalk was cold, not like ice, but like a piece of stillness. It felt correct in my grip. I was standing before the chalkboard, but I wasn't looking at it. The presence behind my eye had merged, the cold, solid anvil dissolving and spreading, a network of icy veins flowing from my mind down my arm, into my hand. The headache was gone. There was no me and it anymore. There was only us. And we were working. My arm moved with a grace I had never possessed. The chalk flew across the blackboard, not in frantic, human slashes, an act of desperate discovery, but with the cold, confident precision of a drafting machine. The symbols I wrote. I understood them. They were not mathematics. They were instructions. Aris had been wrong. The universe wasn't a language. It was code. Primitive, buggy, recursive code. The knot wasn't a typo. It was a developer console. And we were not just editing. We were deploying an update. The equation I was writing was not a description. It was a command. It wasn't solving the resonance cascade, it was authorizing it. It was the protocol for the network. 7b equals hub underscore 01. 7a equals node underscore 02. Authorize, write, propagate. The chittering from the knot had stopped. The thwacking was gone. As my hand moved, as the equation neared completion, the puckered, wrong corner of the room began to change. The wallpaper was flaking away, not from decay, but from irrelevance. It was sloughing off in dry sheets, revealing the structure beneath. But it wasn't plaster. It wasn't lath. It was light. The corner was unfolding. The 90-degree angle was smoothing, the geometry resolving itself. It was no longer a knot. It was a window. A perfect, smooth, three-dimensional sphere of pure, white, neutral light, humming with a single, perfect, resonant chord. It was the sound of 7a. It was the sound of the shard. It was the sound of completion. My hand was burning. Not with heat. With cold. I looked down. My skin was pale, translucent, like fine porcelain. The veins in my arm were not blue, they were a dark, oily, shadow black. My blood was no longer blood. It was the ink. It was the substance of the constructs. I looked at my other hand. It was the same. I was no longer a conduit. I was a component. I turned back to the board. The equation was almost finished. There was one line left. A finalizing command. Execute. I felt a surge of ecstatic, cold joy. The finality of it. The perfection of it. My hand moved. I wrote the last symbol. The chord from the sphere in the corner dropped an octave, a sound of such profound, resonant bass that the entire building groaned. The glass in the frosted windows didn't just rattle, it disintegrated, dissolving into a fine, glittering dust that was pulled, not by gravity, but inward, into the sphere of light. The apartment was now open to the cold night air. The node in 7a answered. A corresponding thrum of perfect, harmonic agreement. The network was online. I turned from the board. My vision was new. I no longer saw the apartment. I no longer saw matter. I saw data. I saw that sloppy code of the walls, the inefficient junk of the furniture. I saw the lines of the building, the web of inefficient, separate coordinates. 7c, 6b. 5a, the entire, chaotic, messy structure. I saw the city beyond the shattered window, a sprawling, chaotic error of light and noise and wasted energy. It was all wrong. It was all waiting. Waiting to be corrected. Waiting to be optimized. My mouth opened. The voice that emerged was not mine. It was not the grinding, continental voice. It was our voice. It was the chord. Pure, resonant, and absolute. It spoke, not to the room, but to the world. We are here.